Hi there, I'm going to give you a brief lecture, obviously on Frankenstein, but I'm going to focus specifically on some Gothic tropes that really help us understand what's going on in the novel. And I'm going to focus particularly on ideas around monstrosity. There's a whole bunch of definitions about the monstrous in the 18th century, 19th century that have evolved into literature and art and culture more generally today. And I'm going to think about ideas around the proper body, the normal body, the abnormal body, the pathological body, so bodies and monstrosity, and at the end a little bit about gender, because it comes to play obviously with discussions about the body. You will see probably a few overlaps with things that you're doing in approaches if you're taking approaches. I'm going to be making some sort of brief references to Foucault's ideas about docile bodies along the way and the proper body. So without further ado, let's get started. Where are you? Okay, so yes, thinking about the cultures of monstrosity. Okay, interesting. Never had that before. Okay, so this is obviously a Gothic text, and so we should think a little bit about genre here. And, what are the concerns across the genre we call Gothic? Well, Gothic is really difficult to define, and I don't think we need to spend time defining it. I think we can just think about it as being this genre that encompasses a lot. The diversity, the longevity, and the adaptability of Gothic literature is nothing short of remarkable. And it has really evolved through the 18th century, 19th century, 20th century, 21st century. And throughout this long history, Gothic writing has responded to an impressive range of cultural phenomena. So you can think about the French Revolution in the 1790s, and then the rise of capital, and then the whole huge expansion into the cities, or movement to the cities in the 19th century, and that bringing with it all kinds of things like crime and overcrowding, contagion, and then all kinds of moral reform movements that the Gothic sort of opens up or responds to. Imperialism, there's a whole strain of Gothic that has to do with the whole colonial project, and all kinds of new advances in psychology, medicine, and criminology, and all kinds of ideas about the body, and in fact just the experience of living in the body and having a psyche. So without further ado, does this mean, yes, okay, there we go. So a couple of, three, in fact, theories to get us thinking about the Gothic and monstrosity in the Gothic. So one of these is abjection, and one of the sort of key theorists of abjection is Julia Kristeva, who writes about it in a text called Powers of Horror. Now, there's a material definition of abject objects. So they are just quite simply things that make us feel repulsed. So vomit, feces, dead and decaying bodies are abject. They're surrounded with disgust. We feel disgusted. We push them away. Slightly differently, maternal bodies are often represented as abject objects because they are, for lack of a better way of putting it, they are bodies out of control. They are leaky bodies. They are bodies that are changing, almost as if they have in the Gothic or the horror imagination, as if they have a parasite or something growing that is foreign and frightening within them. And they leaky, they are bloody, they're milky kind of bodies. And so there's a sort of abjection around them often in the history of representations of maternal bodies. So that's just a little tradition. It will make sense why I'm emphasizing it here. So Kristeva writes in typically difficult, sort of opaque French style theory of theory writing. I do not want to assimilate it, the abject thing. I expel it. I spit myself out. I abject myself within the same motion through which I claim to establish myself. So what is she saying here? So she's saying that there is a psychological element to the abject, and that is partially having to do with the establishment of the self as an individual, separate from the parents, separate from everyone else. So, you begin life, you're very vulnerable, you are very dependent upon others, you identify yourself through your mother mostly, but then we need to push that away. We object the maternal, she says. We object the object or objects which have created us in order to construct our own identity. So there's something, this may seem to be away from Frankenstein at this point, but it's just getting you to think about how some of these things might play out in the novel. So things that are disgusting, bodies that are sort of out of control, the struggle to identify oneself, to establish one's sense of oneself in the world. So if you can think about the creature, how he goes through all these processes of wanting to connect desperately with a paternal or a filial figure, and then he also pushes against that, and he makes relationships, he destroys relationships, destroys people. He is himself an abject figure who the father Frankenstein pushes away, expels. So there's all that kind of stuff going on there. And don't forget that the novel, early on establishes a kind of scene of abject monstrosity around the female pregnant body that dies. And in fact, the film of at least one of the films of Frankenstein really focuses on this kind of bloody scene whereby Frankenstein's mother dies in childbirth. So related to that is the idea of the double or the doppelganger. Now this will take ages to go through. There are so many reasons for having this pairing of figures in Gothic literature. So, sometimes there can be a double that emerges when one character represses emotion or desire, and that emotion or desire takes the form of a double, or there's a tragedy or some event in the past of a character's life or a family's life, and this double figure sort of returns, this ghostly specter from the past, in order to haunt someone or a group of people in the present. The double can be a figure who is a figure the double can be a figure that is a person who is protesting or pushing back against a dominant culture, and that dominant culture's morals or ideas or definitions of the norm. It's this figure of abnormality or this figure of monstrosity that pushes back against that dominant society and its ideas. And there's many, many, many more reasons for having doubles. They express many, many, many more things. But we're going to sort of focus on a certain kind of doppelganger here with relation to Frankenstein. And we'll just think about Frankenstein and his monster or his creature as a double. They are doppelgangers. And there's lots of evidence in the novel for them as this kind of pairing. When there's the sort of outside bit when he is up in the frozen north, Frankenstein says, "Why had he come so far upon the ice in so strange a vehicle?" He replied, "To seek one who fled from me." to seek one who fled from me. So the idea of, the creature fleeing from Frankenstein, Frankenstein fleeing from the creature, and yet they desperately want or need, and you could almost say desire in a certain way each other for certain kinds of reasons. And he also says, I considered the being whom I had cast among, this is Frankenstein speaking, I considered the being whom I had cast among mankind nearly in the light of my own vampire, my own spirit let loose from the grave and forced to destroy all that was dear to me. So this is Frankenstein sort of saying, this is me. He's my vampire, the thing that feeds off me, that sucks my blood, but is part of me. It's my spirit let loose. It's something dark in me that is destructive and that is destroying my family. So it's not the creature, the monster that's doing the destroying, it's Frankenstein. And Frankenstein and his monster are in, Peter Brooks writes, a critic writes, in an exacerbated dialectic of desire, this dialectic push and pull, this connection of desire in which each needs the other because the other represents for each the lack or gap within himself. And that's another that's a very common sort of model in Gothic literature for doubles. One of them fills a gap or addresses a lack. So our third idea to throw in here, and by the way, these three are related, they're very closely related. Doubles are often uncanny, or one of them is particularly uncanny. Now the uncanny is the English version. I just realized, hang on, my spin washer is on, it's making a lot of noise. Hang on a second. It's very distracting. Okay. So the uncanny, so in the German, so the term really took hold in literary studies after Freud wrote an essay on the uncanny, and he wrote it after reading The Sandman, which is a Gothic German short story by E.T.A. Hoffmann. And there's a lot of uncanny things that are going on in that short story, and I totally advise you to give that a read if you're interested in this topic. But Freud defines the uncanny, the unheimlich, as the familiar in the unfamiliar. Okay, so we think of words like familiar and unfamiliar as opposites, but in this case, the two are absolutely merged together. There is unfamiliar stuff within the most familiar thing. So that's why the uncanny is often has to do with the domestic, with spaces and places and people that seem the most safe, the most normal, the most secure, the most maternal, you could say, the most, place of safety. Within that, there is a kind of dark underbelly and uncanny something or some things often. And you can see that again in this text. Home, family, marriage, children, the most kind of banal domestic things are made deeply uncanny in this story. Novel. Story. It's a story. It's a novel and a story. Okay, so there's another, there's a context which we should consider here. Now, it's a small detail in the novel, but it's absolutely a must to think about, and that is, what is Frankenstein's creature, the monster? What is he made of? He's made of the most familiar, the most normal things, that is, human body parts. He is this ghostly specter that haunts the human, and he is human. He is made out of human parts. And so this comes, so you'll notice that Frankenstein, goes in the middle of the night and goes to the charnel house, graves, etc. and gets body parts which he joins together, making his human. Now this is a context because in the 18th century and in the 19th century there was medics had to research, had to understand anatomy, physiology, all of that, and so they performed dissections. And there was, because it was difficult to get bodies to dissect, there was a lot of what was called, body snatching or grave robbing, or was called resurrection, because they would resurrect the bodies from the graves. It was going on at the time, and up until 1832, when the Anatomy Act gave unclaimed bodies from jails and hospitals and workhouses to anatomists for dissection, for research. So there's this whole kind of dark medical context that's really, really important here. And this also is, in the cultural imagination of the time, a real source of monstrosity. This taking the body apart, it's gross and stinky and awful, and it crosses some sort of lines, and there's something kind of abject about the anatomist who spends his time in these sort of dark labs and theaters, as they were called, performing these dissections, as these images indicate. And there's just a couple images of body snatching, just because they're nice. Okay, now that's related to another thing I want to throw in this mix, and that is thinking about this division between the normal and the pathological body. There's a lovely chapter in Paul Youngquist's book, Monstrous Bodies, about Frankenstein, and he talks about how the monster haunts the proper body in this novel, how the monster assaults the social practices that enforce the legitimacy of the proper body. So what he's saying is, this monstrous specter that is getting us to think about how we define the proper body, how we shape the docile body, to use Foucault's expression. All the social practices, all the morals, all the laws, religious tenets, all of this that comes to bear on the docile body, forming it, educating it, bringing it up into being a proper body in life. So doing, the normal things, doing the productive things, following through in this very, normal, productive, legitimate kind of life. And how that monster is constantly reminding us that there is only ideas of normality because there are ideas of pathology. Via the monstrous body, via the pathological body, that is how we define the normal. It kind of maps on, in some ways, to Edward Said's Oriental-Occidental or Occidental-Oriental. That one, the definition of one is used to describe or define the other. The Oriental used to define the Western, the Occidental. Same with this. The pathological is used to define the normal. So yes, let's leave that there. Now let's take the ideas about monstrosity and abject bodies and consider gender. And I'm going to throw something else in here which you may or may not have heard of. That is separate spheres ideology. Now, let's think about what critics have had to say over the years about what is the message, what is the point, what is the story, what are we going to argue, what's the themes, what's going on here, what is Mary Shelley trying to get across in this tale, if anything. And there's been a lot in the 1970s and 80s, a lot of writing about a lot of writing that supports a certain kind of reading, let's put it that way. And they tend to emphasize women's bodies and childbirth, and you will have heard many times probably that, you know, this the moral of the tale is that, you know, man should not, you know, usurp the position of God. She should not usurp the position of woman, who is supposed to get, you know, be the bearer of children, and all of that. But I want to really trouble those readings, and other people have too. And I'm going to make reference to the film Alien, and if you don't know it, I absolutely recommend that you do see it, and at least take a look at the chest burster scene, which is like a man's body. Well, it is a man's body, but it's as if it is giving birth, but it's giving birth to this monstrous, abject, disgusting alien out of his body. There's a real kind of Frankensteinian flavor to that scene, and there's real interesting comparisons and contrasts to be made between them. So, way back, some decades ago, in Female Gothic, Ellen Moores made the point, or suggested, that Frankenstein is a woman's myth-making on the subject of the birth. Sorry, I missed the first quote there. There's a quote mark. This is what she says. Frankenstein is a woman's myth-making on the subject of birth and what follows birth, the trauma of the afterbirth, i.e. it's about this kind of the abjection. It's a slightly, although normal, childbirth, there's something abject about it. So it's also this kind of uncanny thing, familiar and unfamiliar. And then, slightly related to that, we have Anne Mellor a couple years later saying that, this quote so annoys me. But anyway, by stealing the female's control over reproduction, there's that old standby, that old argument. By stealing the female's control over reproduction, Frankenstein has eliminated the female's primary biological function and source of cultural power. Indeed, for the simple purposes of human survival, Frankenstein has eliminated the necessity to have females at all. Be clear about what Anne Mellor is saying here. And if you don't see trouble in this statement, you're not being a critical reader. Frankenstein has eliminated the female's primary biological function. Primary. Underline those key words. And source of cultural power. So she is saying that this is female's power to give birth, and that this is their primary biological function. Not to breathe, to work, to think, whatever. It's to give birth. Indeed, you know what? You don't need to have females at all, because that's all they contribute. So really problematic statement, I would say. Victor is engaged upon a rape of nature, Mellor says further, a violent penetration and usurpation of the womb in place of a heterosexual attachment to Elizabeth. Victor has substituted a homosexual obsession with his creature. Really, really problematic also. So she's saying that there's a homosexual obsession in which Victor desires sexually his creation, and that she compares that to a rape of nature, a violent penetration of the womb. So all these things are problematic, but they are all connected together. That is also very problematic, I would say. And Barbara Creed, who has written, she's a very well respected critic, as is Anne Mellor, and has written some wonderful things, but I'm afraid I do disagree with her statements about how disaster ensues when a man appropriates the power of woman. There she is, just sort of repeating Anne Mellor, by attempting to give birth to new life without the agency of woman, as if woman's agency is her ability to give birth, and as if that is the sole or dominant power of woman. So for me, these are really problematic readings, and I raise them because, one, because I want to call attention to how important it is what you're doing, learning to think critically, to engage in conversations about what texts mean, what language is there, and what what the tropes and images and narratives tell us about culture then, but also, we're part of making meaning now about the texts we engage with. And so we need to think about our own lenses and think about what sort of uses and abuses texts are put to in our day. Now, it's not that I just want to read my own opinions back upon the novel. I'm going to say that there is evidence that refutes it. There's evidence in the text that refutes these problematic statements. And so here I'm going to offer some critical rebuttal to what I would call deterministic essentialist readings, like the ones on the previous page. Deterministic because they say that this is what your purpose is. You're biologically determined to do this and this with your body, and essentializing because it's saying this is what men should do and should be like, and this is what women should do and be like, and based upon their biology, the fact they have a womb, they should be this. So I take up Barbara Johnson's observation that the women characters in this novel are beautiful, gentle, selfless, boring nurturers. They're boring and they're victims who never experience inner conflict or true desire. I agree with her. There's a question about, Mary Shelley's writing this novel. She's educated, she's thinking, she's sharing ideas with thinkers and writers and philosophers, really interesting people. And she writes this novel, and you could, ask yourself as a reader, where are all the interesting, deep, thoughtful, capable, able women in this novel? And why are they killed off all the time? I mean, they are just like, one goes, next one goes, the next one goes, they're all killed off. So on the one hand, I want to hold that sort of bunch of questions in our mind, and then I want to think about going back to what we began with, thinking about the double and the relation between the men. So Robert Walton, the explorer, and Frankenstein and his own friends, Frankenstein and his creature and his monster. For me, it's not a homosexual desire, it is a homosocial relationship. So homosociality means, quite simply, the close bonds between men. So this is an era in which men, they were educated together, they worked together, they were in parliament together, they were in business together, they traveled together. So this is there's a real strong homosocial bonds that do not include women. Now, it's homosocial, not homosexual. So yes, there could be desire, but this is about sociality, sociability, relationships of that nature. Now, separate spheres goes along with that. So separate spheres is the idea that men belong in the public sphere at certain times. Hang on, I'm not saying they do belong in public. There were ideas in the 19th century that men should rightly take their place in the public sphere. So in the universities, in, as I said, government, in business, in travel, in the military, etc. And then they would come home to, the private domestic sphere. But women largely, not this isn't like set in stone, and of course there's lots of variety and it's different between classes, and lots of women went out and worked and had lives in the public sphere. But generally there was this kind of structure, social structure about separate spheres. So largely women would tend to be confined more to the private sphere, to the home, to the space. Now, bringing all this stuff together that I've raised, the double, homosociality, separate spheres, going back, thinking about bodies and making bodies and what happens with bodies here, and what is monstrous, what is truly monstrous in this novel. And And yes, and thinking back to abjection, what is happening here in this novel? So I would say this is my argument back. The idea that women's power lies in childbearing is a biologically deterministic statement. Such sexual branding reduces women to a sum of their reproductive parts and suggests that they are childbearers foremost. More than suggests, says that they are childbearers foremost. But I would offer this reading instead. In Frankenstein, the thing that is, a message, if we can say that here, or the thing that Shelley may be suggesting through this narrative, and the thing that I see that is problematic in the story, that we are sort of urged to think about, is the fact that women are excluded from science, where Frankenstein and all of his mates are in the university involved in science. They are excluded from politics and philosophy, from the public sphere. And that is the reason that, or at least part of the reason, that there are ensuing disasters. Not because Frankenstein's taken the power from them to give birth. No, it's because they're excluded from the public sphere. They're excluded from participating in this world. The homosocial world of this novel, all men, challenges the notion that women are intellectually and biologically less suited to the public sphere than men. It challenges the notion that women should be childbearers foremost. It actually challenges that. The monster is a manifestation then of separate spheres ideology. That's what's monstrous about this society. And that's why it goes completely awry. But that's the reading that I am suggesting to you. And I would love to hear your thoughts about it, and hope you'll consider it. Just if you want to, I've only written about it a little brief bit. You can see I've taken it from a book called Gothic Evolutions, but it's in there in a little bit of a longer passage if you want to look it up. So excellent. I hope you enjoyed the novel. Thanks for listening.